Good morning, everybody. Hi, hello. I'm Elie Rekhess, and I'm one of the co-sponsors of this symposium, along with others. I'm really happy to open the second day of our convention. We started last night. For those of you who just joined us today, we started yesterday afternoon at 4 p.m. so that it would coincide with our class on water in arid lands, Israel and the Middle East. And we had a keynote presentation by 𝐂𝐬𝐫𝐾𝐳, who gave indeed an overview of the complex question of desalination in the region with all the implication that it has. So now we move to our second day with a good number of presentations by our guest speakers. And the first session will be chaired by Professor George Wells, whom I want to briefly represent, and then he will take over and present all other speakers. So George is an associate professor at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, Northwestern University, where he directs the environmental, biotechnology, and microbial, did I pronounce it correctly? Microbial and ecology laboratory. The goal of his research is to deepen knowledge of the microbial world to inspire innovative microbial community management strategies to clean water, generate energy, and recover resources from societal waste stream. George has authored more than 60 peer-reviewed journal articles. He's part of the 𝐾𝐬𝐥 group that was established last year, of which he will be talking himself later and explain all about it. So, George, you know what? Without further ado, why don't you take over? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elie. Really a pleasure to be here. I am an engineer through and through, so this is really fun to have this opportunity to interact with political scientists, historians, and the like on water issues in Israel and the Middle East. Our first speaker for this morning is Professor Julie Trottier, who's the Director of Research at the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique, CNRS, in France. She also teaches critical political ecology of water at Sciences Po in Paris, and has worked on Palestinian and Israeli water issues for 28 years, I believe. So a wealth of knowledge and expertise. So I look forward to your talk, and I'll hand the microphone over to you, Julie.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Northwestern University for inviting me and offering me such a wonderful promotion, because I'm not the director of research in the CNRS. I am a director of research. It's this title in France means professor. Except we're only paid to do research. So, well, thank you very much for being here today. So let's dive in. Before we talk about anything, I would like to dispel 3 common confusions that run through the water literature. And when I say water literature, I don't mean what journalists write about water. I mean our journals, our scientific journals. The first common confusion is that we talk about water use in the same way we talk about water consumption. We use those words as if they were synonyms. They're absolutely not. When you wash your hands under a tap, you're using water, but you're not consuming it. When you're using water, you may consume it or you may not. It may stay in the terrestrial system. There's only 3 ways right now. There's a 4th way in development, but that's the topic of another talk. Right now, there are only 3 ways for water to leave the terrestrial system. Either it will evaporate from the ground, or it's going to be transpired by an animal or by a plant, or it reaches the sea. And there is a 4th way now of water leaving the terrestrial system that is in development, but we'll leave that for another talk. And if you only have this take-home message after this talk, please remember this. Water use is not the same as water consumption. Don't confuse the two. So this is why domestic water uses quite a bit of water, but consumes hardly anything, because the water that you use domestically will go back into the system. Whereas irrigation around the world is the big water consumer. Plants can't go and set themselves in the shade. They need to transpire to keep their organism at a temperature where they can stay alive. So this is why all over the world, irrigation is everywhere the biggest water consumer, not domestic water. So, and this is very important because when people they mean well, and they say, oh, we're facing a drought, we have to do water savings. Well, here you're not consuming water. Here you are. So if you do a 1% efficiency gain here, you have a much bigger impact than if you have a 1% efficiency gain there. So that's a first common confusion, and you will never fall in that trap again, right? So second confusion is we talk about water as if it was a stock. Water is a flow. And that's why we should have had a 3-hour discussion about the Falkenmark water stress indicator, because it treats water as a stock, and that is its biggest problem. So if you look at water as a flow, as a stock, you say, oh, this country has so many million cubic meters. That partner has so many million cubic meters. We don't care. Because what we're all doing, especially in transboundary water management, is we're all interacting with the same flow. So water follows a trajectory, and it follows 3 kinds of trajectory at the same time. It follows a spatial trajectory through space. It follows an institutional trajectory, and it follows a sectoral trajectory, all at the same time. So let's take them one by one. When it follows a spatial trajectory, say precipitation falls on top of a mountain, the snow melts, it seeps into the ground, it rises as a spring here, it flows, seeps into the ground, shows up in the 𝐾𝐚𝐳 system, flows through the aquifer again, shows up then in the surface water, maybe held up by a dam, and then reintegrates the soil again. Water is a flow, and it will be the same water drop is used by many different actors successively. So when I spoke about the spatial trajectory of water, the trajectory through space, it's really important, because suppose the rain falling on that mountain is falling on a mountain that has been terraced, built into many successive terraces, like we have in the Middle East, like we have in the south of France. Then water will seep into the ground much more, and the capacity of the soil to absorb and retain water will be much greater than if you just don't maintain those terraces and let the runoff flow. So we tend to think, when we tend to think of water as a stock, as soon as we have a water problem, we think we need more water. Well, maybe we don't. Maybe we need just to change the permeability of the soil. Maybe we need just to think about how we've transformed the space to see whether we could better interact with that flow of water. And you have to bear in mind the institutional trajectory of water. That is extremely important. When a decision is made here on what to do with that spring, what uses are you going to put it to, how much water are you going to direct to which field or which other field, it usually is through a local farmer-based institution. And those decisions will be responsible for how much of that flow is used and stays in the system, and how much of that flow is used and leaves the system because it's consumed. And every time it's going to be used again, you will have a different institution making those decisions. So you always have to bear in mind water is a flow, and the same water drop is used by many different actors, and the decisions made on how to manage that water drop is made by a great variety of institutions. Now, Israel was the first country in the world to put out what hydrologists call the modern water law, because it said the state is going to manage every single water drop in the country. Even in Israel, you find local institutions that are along this water trajectory. It's probably the country in the world where you have the most centralized water management. Even there, you can identify some institutions like that. If you go over to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, that's my specialty, is Palestinian water, then you find it's the opposite from Israel. Most of the water is managed locally by institutions that have nothing to do with the state. So thinking in terms of water as a flow is extremely important. Please never, never consider the water stress indicator of 𝐒𝐿𝐼 in the same way again, because you'll bear that in mind. Now, we should have a full conference just on deconstructing the 𝐒𝐿𝐼 indicator and the impact it's had on the water world. Third confusion, and then we can finally go on to the talk. Third confusion you will never fall into again is confusing need for demand. Have you noticed any golf course that wants more water to irrigate grass in the middle of the desert will tell you, we need water? No, you don't. You're expressing an economic demand for water. What is a need? A need is determined by biology. You have a physiology. That means that you need to drink water, otherwise you will die. You also need water to eat, to cook, and for basic hygiene. This is a need. It's determined by biology. And I think, unless we have some strange individuals in the room, I think we all agree that we collectively have a responsibility to see to the fact that everyone's needs for concerning water be satisfied. Demand is a completely different concept. Demand is an economic concept. It's how much money you're willing to pay for that much water. So depending on what you'll do with this water, it might be worthwhile for you to pay a lot of money. If you want to set up a golf course in the middle of the desert, you may have Trump as a customer. You know, he'll pay a lot of money to come to your golf course. So you're willing to pay a lot of money to irrigate your golf course. And your business plan is probably completely sound, actually. But you're expressing a demand. Don't dare you say you need the water. It's not a need, it's a demand. And this is super important because technically speaking, you may be dying of hunger and dying of thirst, but your demand is satisfied. Because if you have absolutely no money, then your demand is automatically satisfied. So please, never again, and never accept to see another water article that confuses need and demand. And once we escape from those three confusions, well, we see the world of water in under a very different light. This is the definition of water security that I would like to propose to you. That's been published in 2022. If you're interested, I can send you the publication. So what I'd like to argue is that water security is achieved when water governance over all scalar levels. That means a water governance you're implementing over the village only, over a basin, over the whole country. Whatever water governance, whatever, all those institutions along the trajectory of water, that this water governance over all scalar levels ensures an interaction with the flow of water that is consensually considered equitable across all social groups, including vulnerable minorities, those, for example, who live without any kind of money income, so they express zero demand, but they still have needs, while also ensuring the long-term sustainability of the environment. So on the basis of that definition, then, let's look at, I'm not good with technology. There. So historically, have we done that? No. We've amazingly accumulated blunders because of those three confusions. So in the Middle East, we have a long tradition of looking at water as a stock. The Johnston Plan in the 1950s, Eric Johnson was special envoy of President Eisenhower, and he literally went from capital to capital saying, how much water from this river do you really need? What would you agree the others take? And the Johnston Plan is entirely quantity-based, as if the moment Jordan takes 22 million cubic meters from the Yarmouk, that water disappears, say. It doesn't. Jordan is just locating itself along a trajectory. We've repeated the same mistake with the Oslo Agreement. You can check it, it's on the web. 1995 agreement, Article 40. The three main aquifers from the West Bank was divided in the same way that you would divide a cake into pieces. And the idea was, if we get the size of the pieces right, it'll work. No, it won't, because this is fraudulent accounting. These are actually millions of cubic meters that are attributed to Israel, millions of cubic meters attributed to the Palestinian Authority. Why is it fraudulent accounting? Because the West Bank, in those days, there was no desalination in 1995. The West Bank is upstream, aquifer-wise, so the water was used once here, and then later in Israel, and maybe again here. Because if a water drop shows up in an Israeli well inside Israel, Mekorot has unified its water management over the country, may very well pump it to Ariel settlement. And Ariel settlement is high up in the West Bank. It'll flow back as wastewater and will show up in the spring again. So actually, this water is how much each authority, each body was abstracting from the environment in 1992. It is not how much was consumed. And actually, what they're abstracting has often been used by the other party by the time they abstract it. So if we think this can be a solution, no, it will never be. Here we're both confusing use and consumption, and we're confusing stock and flow. So what I'm trying to argue here is we have to use a trajectory-based approach. It's very simple. You identify the trajectories that water flow through space, through institutions, through sectors. Then you identify along every water trajectory which actors are interacting with the flow of water. Are they farmers? Are they industries? Are they cooling nuclear reactors with that water? Then you identify the land and water tenure that these actors are inserted in. And this is a very important word. Much work had been carried out over the years about land tenure and very little about water tenure. When the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations tried to develop voluntary guidelines concerning fisheries tenure, land tenure, forest tenure, and water tenure, they dropped water because it was so difficult to look at water tenure. What does tenure mean? Tenure is the set of interactions among people as individuals or as collectives concerning their interaction with the resource, whether it be informal or formal. And when you look at land tenure, there's a lot of work on land tenure already, you see that this is a very complex set of interactions among human beings. Now, FAO has at the courage to launch a program about water tenure, and you can see the publications on the web, but apart from that program and my publications, I don't think anybody uses yet the word water tenure. And so yesterday we saw that David Katz finally did something that turned out to be useful. If I see some more people using the word water tenure, I would get there, David. I could join you saying, oh, at least I did one thing in my life that proved to be useful. So, and then once we've understood these tenure modes, and if we have more time in question time or in this talk, we can go a bit more in depth about that. Then we have to identify the unwitting water uses and the unwitting negative impacts on water. For example, when I was telling you about those terraced mountains, well, whether or not you maintain those walls that keep the terraces there depends on your land tenure. And if your land tenure means that you're no longer maintaining them, then water won't seep into the ground anymore. It'll just flow straight to the next users. So you've just dispossessed the users of water that were located in that portion of the trajectory of water. So actually, this is a simple methodology, but that shows you water in a much greater complexity than using a quantitative-based indicator. Now, why is it difficult to integrate? Because our modern water management was based on very hypothetical context. It was based on the idea that the state manages water over the entire national territory. I'm sorry, I've been working on water for 28 years. I've never managed to validate that hypothesis. I've always been able to invalidate it. It was also based on the hypothesis that only one law applies to water over the entire national territory. I've never seen this happening. This is a well in Habla, in a village in the West Bank. This well was dug in the late 50s, early 60s by farmers who pooled their savings to do it. So they created what they call a well company, but in fact, it's a common property regime that they apply over this well. There's a well operator who lists everyone who's asking for water and counts how many hours of water they direct to his field. So the well is connected here to this set of pipes. And depending on which farmer has asked for water, then you'll open the pipes that lead to his field. This is entirely managed locally. When we had those Oslo agreements, the Oslo agreement said the Palestinian water authority is now responsible for managing all of the Palestinian allocated water, both for domestic uses and for irrigation. 70% of Palestinian used water was at that time used in this manner by institutions that had rules. The water tenure was very clear. They had local rules that were very well followed. If you ask all of those wells have an accountant. If you go up to those wells and you say, can I have the list of how much water you've given whoever, either they have a computer and they tell you, do you have a USB key? I'll download it on your key. Or they open their accounting books if they still use paper. And I remember there was a visiting researcher from Colorado who accompanied me on the field, and she said, in one day, you get more results than I get in Colorado in 2 years. Why? Because this is extremely transparent, because it's a communal property regime. So every member of the community has to be reassured that water does go to everyone in a fair way, in an equitable way. So the social control here is extremely high. This is social capital. This is something you can build on. When we had the Oslo Agreement, we didn't build on this capital. Actually, international consultants came to Palestine, and they wrote a Palestinian water law in English. It was promulgated in 2002, and the first beginning of a translation of this water law into Arabic was done by the youth group of the Palestinian Communist Party. And they set up a website and they started translating the law from English to Arabic. So basically this law was based on hypotheses like this one, which were not realistic, which are invalidated with 1 day of field work. And so they didn't capitalize on the social capital that existed there. Now, what are the benefits of integrating a trajectory approach? Well, it allows you to make custom-built transboundary management institutions. That's what we propose. When David Brooks and I were asked to write the water proposal for a water accord between Israel and Palestine, that's what we wrote. We proposed an institutional construction where all of those local water institutions, both formal and informal, would be part of wider institutions where the State of Israel and the Palestinian Authority would also have their say. And you can, once you have a trajectory approach, you can actually build custom-made transboundary management that are not based on fanciful hypotheses, but are based on how people actually interact with water through water tenure and through land tenure. And that allows you to have to build a custom-made agreement, maybe, between a state that has centralized water management and a state that has decentralized water management, like Israel and Palestine. And it allows assessing the positions of every actor along the trajectory, which right now we're not doing. We are making a lot of those actors completely invisible. And this has deep social costs. So let's look at a few examples. This is the West Bank. And as you know, there's a lot of problem with wastewater flow in the West Bank. So Israel has been building these wastewater treatment plants along where you see the blue shape. That's where they've built a wastewater treatment plant. The manner they fund them is that with the Paris Protocol, all of the import duties for goods imported into the West Bank are collected by Israeli customs. And Israel transfers this money to the Palestinian Authority. But before it transfers this money, it deducts the water bill and it deducts the electricity bill. There is no electricity production in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. All of the electricity that is used there is produced inside Israel. So, and 60%, 59 to 60% of the drinking water that's used in Palestine is actually bought from Mekorot. So Palestinians are drinking desalinated water. And so but they also deduct the capital cost for building those wastewater treatment plants and the operational costs. So of course the Palestinian Authority says, well, we're paying for those wastewater treatment plants, and we're paying for the operational costs as well. So, and the water comes from our place. So it's ours, isn't it? But it's not given back to the Palestinians, it's allocated to Israeli farmers for irrigation. Now, the Palestinian Authority doesn't like this bill. Of course, it's about a $37 million bill, $37 million bill a year. So it's a sizable bill. And so what they're trying to do is reduce the flow of wastewater going through the Green Line in order to reduce that bill. So donors, such as USAID now, such as the European Union, are paying for wastewater reuse projects in agriculture just to use that treated wastewater and get plants to evaporate it as fast as possible so they reduce that flow of wastewater. What we're doing is exactly the opposite from what we should be doing, because what we're doing is sending water as fast as possible to a use of water that consumes the water, instead of maximizing the uses of water before we reach a use of water that consumes it. But our political setup means that we're going straight into the wrong direction. And in 2017 in Sweden, we had the Seaweed Week, the World Water Week. In 2017, it was entirely devoted to wastewater. Every single conference started by the most amazing sentence. The people stood up and said, when you treat wastewater, you're creating a new resource. I beg your pardon? You are not creating a single resource, and we know that since the 18th century, you know. What you're doing is you're changing the trajectory of water. You're changing from trajectory A to trajectory B. Now, please, don't anyone say, oh, Julie said we shouldn't treat wastewater. No, I never said that. Everyone who's treating wastewater is my friend, okay? But reusing it directly in irrigation can be a disaster, because it's changing the trajectory of water from where it should be going. Releasing it into the environment is not wasting it. More than 24% of the biodiversity lives in the soil. If you no longer release water into the environment, you are destroying that biodiversity in the soil. And if you want the soil to be able to have a good water retention capacity, you need a healthy biodiversity in the soil. So you're creating more problems for farmers in times of drought if you're reusing water directly in irrigation rather than let it go through the environment. An earthworm in the soil is using water, but he's not consuming it. Water goes through his body, or her body, well, they're hermaphrodites, and goes on its trajectory. So those users in the soil, I love the idea of the microbial program. I'd love to hear more about it, because a lot of those water users in the soil are actually microorganisms. And they're essential if you want the soil structure to be able to retain water. And this is our biggest challenge. At least around the Mediterranean, we are getting hotter summers, long droughts, and we need to do everything we can to keep the capacity of the soil to retain water. It is far more important than focusing on irrigation in order to face the droughts. So, the new context for water negotiations and management now, what are we facing? Well, we are now in a context of advanced globalization. We are seeing a democratic crisis everywhere in the world, in France, in Israel, everywhere in Turkey, in the United States, and we're seeing climate change at the same time. This is if you want in the questions, you can come back why I put a date palm tree and an empty irrigation canal in the West Bank here, because the two are completely linked. Officially, this date palm tree is a good solution facing climate change, because date palm trees transpire so little water, right? In fact, what I can demonstrate to you is that this is the worst calamity that's ever befallen the Jordan Valley. So why is globalization so important? Because it's fueling contract farming. And many non-state actors are now becoming very, very powerful. Are you all aware of what is contract farming, or should I explain it? You all know what it is? Okay. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm trying to save that. But it's useless if you don't understand it. So contract farming means that when the farmer seeds the crop is already sold. usually to a chain of supermarkets. So the farmer already knows at exactly what price he's going to be selling his crop. That's reassuring for the farmer, because you can have a bumper crop and then you don't manage to sell it, which is the big anguish for a farmer. But the downside of contract farming is that the farmer becomes a technician on his own land, because the contract is really precise. It tells you how many times you have to put pesticide, herbicide, everything. And if you don't obey that contract, you lose it. So, and what we're seeing now is, for example, we've had our first arrêté sécheresse in France. What do they say? They say that we have to extract less from the environment. We have 4 different levels of alert. And then in tiny script at the bottom of those 4 different alerts, and this is pretty severe in France. Last summer, we had over 100 municipalities that didn't have tap water. This is how bad it's getting. And in small script, we see, but the contract farming agriculture is exonerated from those cuts, water cuts. So this is an economic model that is very powerful and is being pushed by all of our governments, the Palestinian government, the Israeli government, every government, French government, it's everywhere in the world. We have a democratic crisis everywhere. And when you have a democratic crisis, you lose your checks and balances. So that when you decide on a water policy, when you decide on what is a good collective decision, well, you're shrinking the pool of actors who can be heard. And agribusinesses who really want their contract farming, and supermarket chains, you know, the people who have an easy access to government, then they become more heard, because the other actors in society are less heard. And then finally, climate change, well, it's affecting the rainfall pattern. So it's causing a panic among those actors who rely on contract farming, and they're making sure that our governmental policies are going to secure their access to water. This is why you see so much adverts for wastewater reuse. Because wastewater reuse is not allowing you to create a new resource. What it's doing is it's securing access to water for one actor. And that one actor is the one who's going to be consuming the water. So there won't be any other actors using the water along a trajectory after that one. So what's happening? Things like this. 25th of July, 2022, the Palestinian Authority Cabinet, the Cabinet of Ministers, decided to allocate 3 million shekels. Doesn't sound like a lot of money here, but to the Palestinian Cabinet, it's a lot of money. Normally, all of the water projects are funded by foreign donors. Here, they use their own money to build water carrier to capture El Badan's water, supposedly to preserve it from pollution and for it not to be wasted. In fact, it's to bring it directly to date palm trees in the Jordan Valley. Why am I finding this problematic? Well, because in this case, as opposed to a lot of local water institutions, we had farmers in villages further down in the valley, close to the Jordan Valley, who actually had rights to this water that had been recognized by a law dated 1953 by the Jordanian government. So when you're a small farmer, when you're a local community, when you're using communal water tenure, then even when your water rights are recognized in law, in writing, your government can just ignore you. And the reason they can ignore you is because officially, with our present water discourse, you don't exist. You're not there. Water's a stock. We use the Falcon Mark water indicator, and only the state manages water, right? You don't exist. We have built a discourse on water where we're making most users, most actors involved in the management of water invisible. And focusing on water as a flow allows achieving water security because it allows you to look at how the management is carried out over every single scalar level. And I just wish I had 24 hours with you, but I think I've already overstepped the time I was supposed to use. But I hope there will be tons of questions, because we could be discussing this until 3 in the morning. We won't be finished. So. Oh, do we do questions straight away? Yeah. Or, okay. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks so much for a great talk, Julie. I think we have a couple minutes for questions. Good.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for that presentation. I had a question on the water reuse angle. So if not for irrigation and for reusing it, how do we allow for water to have a second life? And what do you propose as a way for us to think about that?
The only time that treated wastewater doesn't have a second life is if you throw it straight into the sea. And even then, it's important for the marine environment. Last summer in France, for example, the rivers we had a lot of rivers that went dry. And the oyster farms and the clam farms actually were in great difficulty because the oysters only grew to half the size they normally grow to. Same with the clams. Because those rivers bring nutrients and they also bring, they bring down the concentration of salt in the estuary. So actually, even when you release treated wastewater into the sea, it's not really a loss, you know. But that's the only case where I could see it justified. For example, in coastal cities, if you throw your treated wastewater in the sea and then you reuse it, then yes, you're giving it a new life. But elsewhere, whenever you're inland, it's already reused. When you release it into the environment, it will either seep in the ground and the microbial life, the earthworms, this 24% of our biodiversity will be using it until it reaches a well, a spring, and then maybe human users will use it again. So actually, the treated wastewater always has a second and a third and a fourth life, naturally, if you leave it along its natural trajectory. But if you direct it immediately to an agribusiness that uses drip irrigation, we should have a full conference only on the issue of efficiency in water management. Because people think drip irrigation is efficient, but it's efficient only if you look at it at the scalar level of the plot. Because what it means is that most of the water you bring to your field will evaporate. Well, it's the end of the trajectory then. There won't be other lives for this water drop because they've been transpired by the plants. So actually, when you're reusing treated wastewater via drip irrigation in a high productivity farm, you're actually ending the trajectory of water. You're only giving it one more life and then it's over. Whereas if you leave it in its natural trajectory, very often you'll find there would be 3, 4, 5 more lives for this water drop before it leaves the system. So I'm not saying we should never reuse. I'm saying we should compare trajectory A and trajectory B. And we should assess how many users, which users, collectively, how do we optimize the collective good with trajectory A and comparing trajectory A and trajectory B. Right now, we are living with a myth that if we don't direct it to reuse in irrigation, we're wasting it. We are not. Was I clear enough? Okay.
Thank you, Julie. And I'm sorry we could not allocate more time for you to further expand, but I was impressed by the last data that you gave about the initiative on the part of the PA from 2022.
July.
It's
less than a year ago.
Yes, I wasn't aware of that. My question is, within the research realm, are there Palestinian researchers that take part in efforts like yours from institutions in the West Bank, outside the West Bank, worldwide?
I suffer from solitude. The problem is people who look at water, who do research in water, tend to be hydrologists or hydraulic engineers. And so to them, farmer organizations, very often they have a perception of them like, oh, this is the past. This is prehistory. Now we're a state. Now we're modern. Now we do things the right way, you see? So they don't pause to think about the fact this is social capital. You need to be an anthropologist to really recognize social capital there and think, oh, this is a historical construction. Actually, it's been going on for a few centuries, so maybe it's sustainable, you know, and it's resilient. So it shows a lot of positive utilities. But these are not the kind of things you're taught to recognize when you do a hydraulic engineering degree. No offense to engineers. You're doing wonderful studies, you know. So all of the Palestinian researchers I know on water are either hydrologists or hydraulic engineers. I tried to interest some geographers. There was Professor Kamal Abdul Fattah, was wonderful. He created the historical geography department at the University of 𝐒𝐳𝐬𝐻. Sadly, he retired. But he tried to interest his students. He tried to put me in touch with his students to do that kind of investigation. But the perception, like in a lot of the around the world that is not Western world, very often the perception is, oh, you want us to bring us back to the Dark Ages? No, we want to wear suits and ties. We went to university because we want to join the modern world. We don't want to go back in time. And very often it's perceived in this way. So I would be delighted to work on this with Palestinian researchers, but the one Palestinian professor who really was enthusiastic about it was Kamal Abdul Fattah, professor, who's a fantastic figure, but he retired now. So.
All right, I think we have time for one or maybe two more questions.
Sure. Very quick one. Are you aware of any efforts to try to utilize blockchain technology to recognize the concept of flow in the water and the projections that would be ideal, and also to incentivize responsible behavior by the user of because the record keeping that you showed was very antiquated, paper-based.
But it works.
Yeah, but could there be a better way to incent positive behavior through new technology?
I missed the early part of your question. Using which kind of technology?
Blockchain technology.
I don't know anything about blockchain technology, so I'm afraid I'm totally incompetent to answer the question.
I think we have time for one quick question here.
Thank you. That's very interesting talk. I was just wondering, to what extent does desalination now change the balance of water in the region and how it's allocated? And is it just deferring problems that still exist because it's helping a little bit, but doesn't solve the core problem?
Now that we have desalination, we have more domestic consumption, and we can have unlimited demographic growth. So we know that the one source of water that will increase over the next years will be wastewater. Because once people use it in their home, now that you think of water as a trajectory, you know it leaves the home. And so this wastewater is what agro-businesses are banking on as their resource for the future. And that's why we have this amazing growth of date palm trees in the Jordan Valley. The settlers are growing date palm trees using hardly treated wastewater. I cannot express it any other way, which is okay because they have they consider it's a 40-meter high filter, and they've never had any health problems with the dates. The Palestinians right now are using fresh water to irrigate their date palm trees, but they want to do just like the Israelis. So the number of hectares that are being cultivated in date palm trees now is amazing. This means a lot of social transformation, because until very recently, people were cultivating in the Jordan Valley, on the Palestinian side, right, Palestinian areas, they were sharecroppers. They didn't own the land. They lived there, they cultivated it, they had food security, housing security, job security, and then they would give half of the proceeds of the crop to the owner, and they would keep half for themselves. Now that we're switching to agribusinesses doing date palm trees, the first thing the agribusiness does is it fences its field, and people can no longer live there. And they will provide jobs, but they hire men only for 2 months of the year at the date picking season from half August to half October. So nobody is going to stay in an area where they have a job only for 2 months of the year. And so people leave. And also, one important thing is food security locally. A lot of people have hardly any income in this area. So when you have nothing to feed your kids, it's not a problem. You go and you pick 𝐒𝐞𝐳𝐬𝐢𝐿 𝐒𝐞𝐳 in Arabic means bread, but it's also the name of a weed called malva in English. And nutritionists tell us that it's a lot more nutritious than steak. So, but it's a natural weed. So the farmer is not cultivating it. So if I go to a farmer and I say, am I allowed to pick the 𝐒𝐞𝐳𝐬𝐢𝐿 in your field? Of course you'll tell me yes. Because A, I'm weeding your field, so I'm helping you with your tomatoes. But B, if you said no, everyone will know it, and there will be such social sanction on you that you don't want to live through that, you know, because it's considered God's work. You didn't work to have this 𝐉𝐫𝐫𝐻 grow. So now people can no longer access the 𝐉𝐵𝐫𝐫. Actually, the agrobusinesses burn it because they consider it uses water that should go to the date palm trees. So we're losing the food security for the poor. We're losing the housing security. We're losing the job security. So what's happening is people are leaving the Jordan Valley. And I can give you the publications. I counted the number of hectares converted into date palm trees and the number of Palestinians who left because of that. And it's quite significant. And it's no accident that Benjamin Netanyahu, before he lost power the first time, you know, in his past government about 2-3 years ago, he said, I now want to annex the Jordan Valley. This is not fortuitous, because he wants the land, but he doesn't want the people. So if the Jordan Valley is becoming empty of Palestinians, it's okay for him. Well, it's a good opportunity for someone like Netanyahu to say, I want to annex it. And what's really interesting here is that this is an economic development that is emptying the valley of its Palestinian population. And it's an economic development led by Palestinian agrobusinesses, thanks to loans by the French Development Bank, by the EU, by donors who actually think they're working towards a two-state solution. So once you start looking at water as a trajectory, you discover quite a few interesting political problems.
Very good. That was excellent. Thanks very much. I have a feeling this discussion could keep going for quite a long time, but thank you very much.